I'm Yulia, the voice of the podcast Love to Heal, a journey of self-discovery, healing, and spiritual growth.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Love to Heal podcast. I have been studying the Hebrew Bible, and one of the stories that particularly spoke to me is the story of Jacob and Esau. So I want to explain to you today why I felt a connection to this story, and perhaps you will find something of a lesson in that story as well. So when I learned about the deeper meaning of the Bible story of Jacob and Esau, and I say deeper because all these Bible stories, they have so many levels, so many meanings that when you read the Bible for the first time, or even the first couple of times, you just may not get to the real meaning of the story, or the real lesson, I should say. And a lot of these lessons are missed by people who simply skim the Bible or, hear about the stories from here and there. But once you really start to dig in, you find there's a lot more complexity in these stories. So I immediately felt a connection to Jacob specifically. And his story is one of basically not being happy with himself, not being happy with his fate. He wanted to be like his brother, like Esau. He, at some point, actually wanted to be him, and he did everything he could to achieve it. For example, the story tells us how he bought his brother's Esau's birthright because Esau was born first. He was supposed to inherit everything from his father Isaac, and of course Jacob wanted that birthright too. And not only that, he ended up tricking his blind father. Isaac was blind already at that point. He was very old. He tricked his father into giving him Esau's blessing. And blessings in those days were very significant, very powerful, very meaningful for a father to bless his children. Especially we're talking about Isaac here, who was a very important character in the Bible. But let's start from the beginning, because I want to make sure that you understand exactly what is going on here between Jacob and Esau and where this sibling rivalry stems from. So Jacob and Esau, they were actually twins of Rebekah and Isaac. And because Esau was born first, he was considered the older of the two. Jacob was born second, and he was actually born holding on to his brother's ankle. And the boys, they were very different from the start. As they grew older, their differences became more and more pronounced. Basically, Esau was a strong hunter. He was a man of the wild, while Jacob, he was the studious kind. He was homey. He spent, for lack of a better word, he spent most of his time studying the Torah. But Jacob wished to be Esau. He wished to be the older, the stronger one. He wished to be the leader. He wished to be the one with the birthright. And he also wanted to be his father's favorite, which from what we gather from this biblical story is that Esau was Isaac's favorite son, while Jacob was Rebekah's favorite son. What Jacob did not understand until many years later was that his fate was to be himself and no one else. And this is because God has a purpose for everyone. And Isaac knew that too, which is why he prepared very different blessings for his sons before his death. But of course, as children and even as adults, a lot of times, we don't think about what God really has in store for us. We can't see the bigger picture, and a lot of times we want to be like somebody else. So as long as Jacob wanted to be his brother, there was always tension and conflict in the family. When Esau found out that Jacob tricked him and took his blessing, he became furious, and he even vowed to kill his brother. It was only when Jacob realized that he was happy as himself, and when he stopped wanting to be Esau, that he felt at peace, and not only with himself, but at peace with the world around him. After Jacob accepted his fate, which was to be the spiritual leader of a holy nation, and not what Esau was supposed to be. Esau was supposed to be a powerful, rich leader of a populous nation. Very different fates. Only then, when Jacob understood that and accepted that, that's when his relationship with his brother miraculously healed. And when Jacob did meet Esau after 22 years of hiding from him, basically, Esau was no longer angry with his brother. Instead, he actually hugged him and wept. Isn't this biblical story so representative of human nature? We always think that grass is greener on the other side. We want what someone else has. But oftentimes when we achieve all that, we realize that we didn't find happiness. This happens all too often. After Jacob took Esau's blessing, he did become wealthy, so he got what Esau was promised, and he did become a man of the land, which he was not destined to be, right? He was destined to be a spiritual leader, to continue learning the Torah and such, but he did become a shepherd, and he realized that he wasn't happy in that role. He couldn't live in peace. He was, of course, afraid of his brother's revenge, and he also didn't really know who he was. He was living a lie. It was not his fate. It was not his destiny. After studying Torah for many years, instead of continuing to study the Torah and to becoming a religious leader, he ended up working for his uncle as a shepherd. In other words, after faking it for 22 years, he went back to Esau to reconcile with him, but also to give him his blessing back so that he could begin life as his true self, Israel, his new name that was given to him by the mysterious man or angel. He was to be a man of God with a wealth not physical, but rather spiritual. So now let me explain why I felt a connection to Jacob. Ever since I was about 14, I wanted to be someone else. I didn't really have an identity of my own, and I kept trying to invent one by taking interest in a culture other than mine. And I feel like this happens a lot to teenagers, probably, right? We're all trying to figure out who we are, but as I've mentioned in some of my other episodes, when you do grow up, let's say in a religious community, when you grow up with a clear framework and you know your background and you know who you are, I feel like it's a little bit easier. But in my case, I was an immigrant, a Russian Jewish immigrant in a new country. You know, I was trying to make new friends, trying to fit in. And for some reason, I took a liking to the Hispanic culture. I began to study Spanish in high school, and I quickly fell in love not only with the language, but with the culture as a whole, with the people, with the music, the dance, and everything else. And at that point, I was also starting to ballroom dance, and I was learning a lot of Latin dances, which of course introduced me to a lot of the music that was in Spanish, that was from Latin American countries. And so of course the music and the dancing really lured me in. And then I started making friends with Spanish speakers, and then I started dating Hispanics. I traveled to as many Spanish-speaking countries as possible. Um, my mom would take me for vacation to the Dominican Republic and other places that spoke Spanish, which was extremely exciting for me, to Mexico, of course, and all that. And eventually, I studied abroad in Costa Rica in college, and I obtained my master's degree in the Spanish language and Latin American culture. By the time that I was in my mid-20s, my Spanish, kid you not, was better than my native Russian and my English. I was literally spending every waking hour of my life listening to Spanish music, reading literature in Spanish, watching movies, TV in Spanish. So everything was in Spanish for me. And when I met Hispanics, they would actually ask me which Latin American country I was from. Typically, they would think I'm from Mexico because I did have quite a few friends from that region, so my accent reflected that. But I was so good at mimicking the accent. I knew so much about Hispanic culture that basically I could pass for Hispanic. And that made me feel really good. I felt like I belonged, and I even made plans for the future of marrying a Hispanic, for my kids to speak the language, to be surrounded by my Latin American friends, all of it. But interestingly enough, while the language and the friends and all that came easily to me, I did notice that my relationship with my family did sort of the opposite, right? It was not improving, it was deteriorating. And especially when I moved away from my family, I moved from Cleveland to Miami, I really felt the distancing between my parents, my brother, and me. And so when I lived in Miami, I barely saw my parents, of course. In fact, I didn't see my father for almost a year. My mom came to visit me a couple of times, and I didn't see my brother either. So that distance, of course, did not feel good. But hey, many people move away from their families, right? It wasn't that extraordinary. So I kept going. I pressed on and planned for my future in a different part of the country. And not only that, but my parents, they were not pleased with the fact that I was not dating Russians and preferably nice Jewish boys, which is the dream of any Jewish parent. So I knew I also was not making my parents proud in that sense. And that felt like some weight on my back, right? It made me feel uneasy. My dad, from time to time, he would remind me that in order to be happy in a marriage, I should have enough in common with my husband so as not to get bored after the initial excitement wore off, right? Because at the beginning, of course, relationships are exciting, there's physical attraction and all that, but once that goes away, once you have kids, what's left, right? And my dad was mostly referring to similarities in culture, in background, and also religious beliefs. Even though my parents were never religious, they always understood their Jewish heritage, and this happens a lot with Jews. Even if you're not religious, you still want to continue the Jewish traditions and such. And so, of course, my parents really wanted me to marry a Jewish man. My dad would also tell me that if I did marry a Hispanic man, that, for example, they would not be able to communicate, my parents and his parents, right? Because, for example, my dad's English is still not good after several decades of living in the country. So they couldn't really have a relationship in that sense. And it would be difficult for us to come together for, say, holidays. and to just become one big family, which is really the dream of a lot of parents, no? To marry their children to someone that they can feel a connection with, and so that we all can celebrate all the important events of life together. As most kids do, I did not listen to my dad, and I kept on doing what I felt was right at the time. I knew that I wasn't making my parents proud. I understood that I wasn't continuing the tradition of our Jewish roots. I was completely abandoning my Russian culture that I grew up with. But I just didn't value all that when I was younger, I suppose. I even remember one of my exes was a Catholic, and I would occasionally go to Mass with him. And one time during communion, we were supposed to accept Christ's body. You know, when they put a cracker on your tongue called the consecrated host? At that moment, when the priest or whoever was leading the Mass, when he put that on my tongue, I can't explain how uncomfortable I felt, because on the one hand, I wanted to fit in and I wanted to make my significant other happy. But on the other hand, I also didn't want to completely be a traitor to my Jewish heritage. You know, it was such an uncomfortable situation. I was torn and confused and just not in a good place spiritually, right? I just didn't know who I was. I was being pulled in different directions. And so, all in all, to compare my story to Jacob's, as long as I wanted to be someone else, life was not easy, right? So, yes, I had fun. Yes, it was, adventurous and wonderful in many ways, but it wasn't easy. I didn't have my parents' support. And when my family would meet my significant other, for example, there wouldn't be a connection, right? Due to our cultural differences. So everything was awkward. There was a lot of translation from Russian to English and then maybe to Spanish. And then, we'd be sitting at the dinner table and many jokes and comments would be lost in translation or just completely not understood. And so, similarly to Jacob, now looking back, I see that God had a different plan for me. I just needed to realize it after years of struggling with finding my identity. After several long and distressing relationships with my exes, and me trying to convert to someone that I was not, finally at age 29, a little bit late in life, but hey, better late than never, I finally listened to my dad and I changed my life around in one day, basically. I had split up with my now ex, and my dad already had a suitor for me in mind. And well, that man has been my husband for 8 amazing years now. And guess what? As soon as we got together with my husband, life was pretty smooth sailing. So if before I felt like I was going against the current, now I was flowing effortlessly with it. All of a sudden, everything became easy. Things just kind of fell into their place. Our families came together and became one big family, like my parents always wanted. So we could celebrate all the holidays and birthdays together. I didn't need to move away because we lived in the same city, which is wonderful, which is great because now that we have kids, we have so much help. I can't even begin to explain how much our parents help us. And I feel so lucky because of that and so thankful to God. We were both, my husband and I, when we met, I realized we were both Russian Jewish immigrants. And when we had conversations, there was this deeper understanding between us. We had a lot in common. I didn't have to explain my life story for him to understand who I was, because we came from the same place. We grew up in Russia. We came to the United States at similar ages. Well, he was 15, I was 11. So basically, there was just a lot of understanding between us, which made it feel like we had known each other for years when we first met and started dating. And then a few years into our relationship, now that we're married and everything and have kids, now we began growing spiritually together and reconnecting with our Jewish roots. Because prior to a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago or so, 3-4 years ago, we were like most of the Russian Jewish immigrants. We know we're Jewish. We go to synagogue occasionally on high holidays, but that's the extent of it. But now my husband and I are really taking an interest in the Jewish religion, in Judaism, and we have been studying the Torah together, and we go to services together, and basically we are growing spiritually together, which I think brings us so close. It creates such a deep and significant connection between us that I can see together we can move mountains. That's how I feel. And something else that's of great importance to me is that we are bringing up our children in a spiritual environment. Our children already know so much about God. So much that I didn't know when I was growing up, right? That God is there to protect us, that we are safe in His world, that God's love is infinite, and I feel like they're growing up much healthier. And I'm extremely grateful that my husband supports me in my podcast endeavor, which takes tons of time and constant resources. I just feel very lucky to have found myself and my other half and all the blessings that come along with being who I was meant to be. I thank God every day for everything that I have mentioned, and even for the hard moments I lived through, because they made me realize that as long as there's conflict within us, there will be conflict around us. So now I have something to compare to, right? I look at my life now and I compare it to my life before choosing the real me, and I can see how important it is to be ourselves. Once we become at peace with ourselves, once we figure out who we really are and stop trying to be like someone else, life takes on a new meaning. In the Bible story, Jacob realized this when one night on his way to reconcile with Esau, he wrestled with, like I mentioned before, with a mysterious man. Some say it was an angel, some say it was God himself. But what's important here is that fight and Jacob's victory in that fight is symbolic of a person's struggle with oneself, with one's identity. And once you overcome that, once you win that fight, and you find yourself and you stop pretending to be someone else because, say, you want people to like you, so you act differently around people, not the way you feel, right? So if you're trying to please people, or you're in a job that pays well but you don't enjoy it, right? You're not being yourself. And so once you connect to your soul's purpose, that's when life starts to feel not like a battle, an uphill battle, but rather like a worthwhile journey of which every moment must be cherished. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you learned something new and interesting. I will leave you with a quote today by actress and singer Judy Garland. Enjoy, and until next time. Always be a first-rate version of yourself and not a second-rate version of someone else.